or stand in the way of sinners, or what's the other word? Sit in the seat of the scornful. How this individual whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law he meditates day and night. And as we were talking about the law this morning in our class, and how the law is more than just do's and don'ts. It is God's peace for us in living a victorious life. And so we talked about this, and how that when God speaks in His Word of character traits, His Word is actually written for whom? It's written for us. And so when He talks about these character traits, He's often talking about people that are in His church. When He speaks of ungodliness and sinfulness and scornfulness, He's talking about people who may be in His church. And how we are not to walk after the way of other individuals, but we are to focus on God, keep our focus on Christ, and the best way to do that is through His Word. Well, and when God speaks of the heathen, He actually names them as heathen, or worldly individuals. Well, today I wanted to look at Psalm chapter 2. But before we do that, I want you to turn to 2 Thessalonians, I believe it is, or maybe it's Timothy, let me see. No, 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17. Because there's a very important point that's brought out here. And we're going to come back to this in just a few moments. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, it says, all Scripture. How much? All Scripture. Now, when this was written, was there a New Testament? It was an Old Testament. That's all they had, was the Torah and the books of the Old Testament. It says, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is what? Profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. It goes on in verse 17, it says that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Now, with that in mind, now let's go to Psalm chapter 2. In the book of Psalm, in chapter 1, we talked last week about how this is focusing on how we are to be. How we are not to follow others, how we are to be focused on God's law, and in focusing on God's law, Jesus said He is actually the embodiment of the law of God, because it is the character of God that is spoken of in God's law. And so we are to follow after Christ, to focus, to meditate on the character of Christ. The character of God as it is revealed in His law and in His Word. And how we are blessed in so doing. In the last verse in chapter 1 says, for the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Now in chapter 2, as chapter 1 reflects on what we are to be and how we can be in God, notice what it says as we get to Psalm chapter 2. Let me write this again. See if I can write this a little darker. Psalm 2 and verse 1, notice what it says here. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? I'm just going to write this just to help do our memory trick. So, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? Question mark. Now, what do you think that means? Well, first of all, it's speaking of the heathen. So this isn't speaking of God's people. This is speaking of the people in the world. And it says, why do the heathen rage? What is rage? Anger. It's uncontrolled, unbridled anger. And yet it says here, why do the heathen rage? Now, what we're going to look at, I want you, as we look at this, I don't want you to think of David's time. I want you to look at this as a book of prophecy. prophecy for the last days. And as we look at this chapter, you're going to see some really amazing things, because it could have been written today. Why do the heathen rage? Why do they have this uncontrolled, unbridled anger? Now, do we see that today? Oh, indeed we do. All over the world. There is, as the Scripture says, they'll cry out, peace, peace, but there is no peace. There is war all over the world. There is war within families. Everywhere there is war. But especially among the people who have no relationship with God, or with a false God. So here we have, he's asking the question, why do the heathen rage? Why do they rage? Because they don't have that personal assurance with the one true God. But he goes on and says, and the people imagine a vain thing. Now, people could be talking about the people that are in or claim to be a part of God's church. And they imagine a vain thing. What's vain? What is vanity?
No use.
What?
No use.
No use.
Selfishness.
Huh?
Selfishness.
Selfishness. Vanity. We think of vanity when people deck themselves out with lots of jewels and makeup and fancy clothes and spend lavish amounts of money on themselves. And yet we see this among the professed people of God sometimes. That they are more focused on the outward appearance than on the man of the heart, as Paul says. And so we need to keep this in mind. So we have the heathen are enraged. We have the people who imagine a vain thing. Something that takes their mind off of the fact that the heathen are raging. You know, I'm trying to think of the best that I can, how I can enjoy this moment of this day. However that may be. Not thinking beyond the present. But let's look at verse 2. In verse 2, it says, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, well, let's put that down. The kings of the earth do what? Set themselves. Comma. Let's stop right there for a moment. The kings of the earth set